It's been a crazy 2020, but we have had some incredible conversations with people serving God globally. In this episode, we recap season 2, talk about next season, and reminisce about Christmas.
Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I'm Nate Tatman.
And I'm Andrew Gale.
And we are two friends
who love Jesus,
care about the church,
and travel the world to share stories of people who do the same.
Our conversations happen in all kinds of places.
Like a coffee shop and an airport terminal.
Or even the back of a crowded taxi.
But no matter where we go, from Argentina to Zimbabwe,
we capture stories of the good God is doing around the world.
And we hope those stories will do you a world of good.
Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I am Nate Tatman here with my co-host Andrew Gale. Andrew, Merry Christmas.
I know, Merry Christmas to you. It's that time.
We did it.
We made it to Christmas.
We did it. We made it to Christmas.
There was some question about that.
We've survived 2020 so far. I mean, there's still a few weeks left, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. Holy cow. Yeah, Stacy and I were reminiscing the other day about 2020 and how the year is almost over. And again, as it always seems to go like this, where on one hand, the year seemed like it went really fast.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, it feels like it was really long. And I feel like 2020 was a long, long year. Thinking back of kind of pre-COVID and what life was like in January and February, that seems like 2 years ago,
Absolutely.
Not less than a year.
Well, and you guys your family made some huge transitions in 2020. I mean, you were already down the road of serving, in Spain, but quitting jobs, going full-time in fundraising, really prepping to go. I mean, like, so much of your life has really shifted in the last 12 months.
Yeah. To think of where we were in January to where we are now and what all has transpired. And the fact that we are still here and not in Spain, it's like, holy cow. It's like, in some ways, it feels like we were just spinning our wheels and ending up in the same places where we started. But we will get there. We shall overcome and get to Spain.
That's right.
So is your Christmas shopping all done?
Well, some, yes. I think most of it's done. So much of Christmas shopping this year was online, which is kind of a constant for me. I'm always putting stuff in my Amazon cart and then waiting with patience until the time that I feel like I can buy it. So, I think so. I made one last purchase yesterday for my wife. My wife always buys her own Christmas gifts because she knows what she likes. And I always try to have at least one or two gifts that surprise her. And she reminded me last night that I'm not very good at that, of surprising her. So we were driving and I told her that I made a purchase online and that she needed to not snoop around to figure out what it was.
It is so hard when you share Amazon Prime accounts.
I know.
It's so hard.
Right. And so I was like, please don't snoop around and figure it out. And she's like, well, I think I probably already know what it was, and named it. And she did not get it right, but she was scarily close to getting it correct. I mean, like, just out of thin air figuring out what it was. It just is a reminder of what I'm terrible at keeping secrets like that. When I'm excited about something and like getting somebody something, even like gifts for my office staff here at Global, like, I have a really hard time keeping a secret. I get too excited about giving it. So, but yes, to answer your question, I think that I am finished Christmas shopping, although I'm sure I'll find something that I have to buy for somebody, and get it anyway. So, but yes, the majority of that is done thanks to my wife. She is the incredible shopper when it comes to finding deals and getting things at the best price at the best time possible.
Nice. I can't remember if I shared this last year or not, but we've kind of started a tradition. Probably, I think this is the third year we've been doing this now, to where, we are a family of 7 and 8, including our daughter-in-law. And so it's kind of a big family to purchase any kind of gifts, let alone Christmas gifts, where it's all in one time of the year. And so what we have done is we have given each of our kids a certain amount of money for Christmas, but that money is not for them. That money is for them to spend on their siblings.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, so we give each of them the same amount, and then it's up to them to either work together. We compile a list. We have a shared notes in our notes app.
Yeah.
And we all put on there our Christmas list. And then some things are more expensive than the average gift. And so some of them will go in and put their money together to buy a gift for the other siblings and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of fun. And then Stace and I usually will go and do the stocking stuffers.
Oh, that's fun.
So that's kind of our gift. And I mean, we do some gift cards and things like that, but it's a little different this year, living on a missionary's budget than than previous years. But it's still a lot of fun, and it's a great opportunity for them to think about gift giving for their siblings and trying to figure out what their siblings would want and like and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Can you believe that we have been doing this podcast for less than a year?
No.
Because you made the comment, you don't know if you mentioned this before about Christmas, but this is our first time to do an episode around Christmas time because our podcast launched last February. Isn't that crazy to think about?
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
That's why I said that. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last year because
we didn't do a podcast at this time last year. So it's crazy to think that this whole thing started.
It just occurred to me that
because I'm thinking about it. Like, the last international trip I had was to Costa Rica. It was with our regional coordinators for global strategy. We met there for our once a year kind of face-to-face outside the country. We meet again in the summer in the U.S., but we meet outside the country. We met in Costa Rica. We had a great time together. It was really refreshing and exciting to think about what God was going to do in 2020. And God's done a lot in 2020, but it was not what we planned and anticipated for at that meeting in January. But it was I remember sitting in my room there in Costa Rica trying to figure out how to load these different podcasts to the website and making sure that things were working. And that was just a year ago. It happened to be my last international trip for 2020, my first and last.
Wow.
But also was kind of the launching point for our podcast, which then launched in February. So we're ending season 2 today, but we've only done less than a year, and it's incredible to me how much connection has been made in just that year. I mean, thousands and thousands of listens to this podcast, to people that are engaging with this content, and so I'm so grateful that in just 10 months that so many different people are getting to hear really cool stories of the things that God's doing.
Yeah, I am too. And it's been just, not only those who have listened, but then also those who you and I have been able to interact with and to interview and have conversations with and to hear their stories and then to share their stories. Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. And,
it has
we're constantly, behind the scenes, you and I. So for those of you that don't know, the plan is to take every January and July off. And that gives Andrew and I just kind of an opportunity to reset, evaluate each season and episode. How do we want to change? Do we want to change? Do we want to keep doing this? and then to look ahead and to plan what next season looks like. And I know we've got a brainstorming session coming up and talking through that, but I'm excited about what the next year holds for this podcast and just some of the conversations that we want to have. Hopefully travel opens back up. I don't know if the first part of the year it will, but hopefully by the second part of the year, it will open up enough to where we can travel and do what we intended to do on this podcast, and that is to interview and have these conversations on the road. And so I'm looking forward to 2021 and what it means for our ministries and this podcast.
But even in the midst of what 2020 has looked like, I'm so grateful for the conversations that have happened, for the people that have been a part of it. It's been an incredibly humbling experience to hear about what God is doing and to be a small part in the story of people's serving God around the world. And so I can't wait to recap a couple of those today as we process that together. But for those of you who don't know, if you want to reach out to us, you can do that on social media. You can sign up to get new episodes of this podcast in your email inbox. You can do that by going to the website chogglobal.org/aworldofgood, and there's a sign up form there. We also post regular updates on the Global Strategy Facebook page. You can also go to the Global Strategy Facebook page and find full episodes there where you can listen to those. Those have all been updated as well. We have an Instagram, search for A World of Good Podcast. We also have a Twitter, A World of Good Pod, where Nate does a great job of adding news articles that may be interesting for you to check out. So lots of different ways for you not only to learn about the podcast, learn about us, learn about what's happening, but to interact with what's happening in the world.
Andrew, so what do you have for us in your final installment of 2020 Coffee Talk?
Now for Coffee Talk.
Well, I wanted to talk just really quickly about my experience with roasting. So I want to talk a little bit about how I roast, what that means, what that looks like, and yeah, just to give a really quick picture of that. So I use what's called it's a fresh roaster. That's the brand Fresh Roaster SR500. It was actually discontinued in 2019 and replaced with the SR540. I love this little roaster. It was a gift from a friend in Indianapolis who was upgrading to bigger and better roasters, and so passed this one on, and I'm so grateful that he did. And again, you can find roasters with more control, with more options, so that you can get a more of an even roast or know more about the temperature settings and those kind of things. And maybe someday I'll invest in doing something like that, but I love getting to figure out roasting with this machine that I have. So one of the factors I want to talk about that I didn't realize was going to be such a factor until recently is the outside temperature of where you roast. So for those who, just to give an image of this roaster, there's a base that's made of plastic, like a black plastic base, and that's where the heating element is. And that heating element pushes hot air up through a fan, and there's a little glass canister that sits on there, and that's where the beans go in. The green beans go in that glass canister. The hot air is forced up through that glass canister, and then there's a little hat that sits on top that catches the chaff from the beans, so that then that chaff just doesn't go everywhere. But it has that little glass canister. You can look in. You can watch those beans as they spin and roast and heat up, and it's a great little machine. The roasting that I do puts off some smoke, so there are other ones that put off less smoke, and that's just a reality. So I actually do my roasting out in the garage, which I'll talk about in a second. The first time that I roasted, though, with it, I was so excited. So I picked this up from my friend on our way back from our trip out to Kansas in July. I got home, and I woke up the next morning like a kid on Christmas morning, like excited to go and roast some coffee that I wanted to drink. So I probably woke up earlier than I should have, definitely earlier than the rest of my family did. So I went and started roasting my first batch. And I thought, I know that it put off smoke because I've done some minor roasting in the past with just some popcorn poppers, which this is really just a really nice popcorn popper. But I've done it with just popcorn poppers before, and I know it puts off a little bit of smoke, but I thought it would be not too much. So I took it back into the little storage room that we have, which is also my home office where I've done a lot of these podcasts from. I plugged it in. I wanted some fresh coffee, turned it on, and within a couple minutes, the entire family was up because our fire alarm, our smoke detector was going off. So it put off slightly more smoke than what I had remembered. So it was not long after that I was requested to go roast elsewhere. So I knew eventually I'd probably end up in the garage anyways because you can open up the garage door and it's a great place. But I was hoping to sneak in at least one roast so that I could have it that morning without going out there. But I now roast in the garage. I'll actually put a picture up on our on the feed for this so that you can see kind of where I roast and what that looks like. And the good news, it's a great location. My garage is a great location in terms of smoke and sound. I mean, roasting is not a quiet thing. It's a pretty loud experience. The bad news is
it's not a great smelling process either. The process does not smell very good.
It just depends. Yeah. I mean, it depends on how burnt it gets. It depends on a lot of different factors. But yes, it can have a very strong smell as well. The bad news is, though, the garage has a lot more variance in outside temperature. So now that we're in cold weather, the temperature in the garage is much colder. And that doesn't bother me. Like, I just bundle up. I was, in my heavy jacket, out there roasting the other day. But what ends up happening is I described that roaster, that glass canister where those beans are, is the only thing that keeps those beans from the outside is that glass canister. And so because of that, the temperature outside really affects the roast of the beans. It can bring that temperature down quicker, or if it's hot, it can bring it up faster. And so how steady that temperature is during the roast is really important. So it's been interesting as I've gone back and kind of watched how the roasting goes. I've noticed that as I looked back on my notes that it's been different during these cold temperatures than the hot temperatures. Now, I'll just pause there because I know some of you are probably saying, what do you mean notes? Yes, I actually have a journal that I keep where I record the date that I roast, what bean I'm roasting, the temperature, how long, when first crack is, second crack. These are all parts of the roasting process. What, how if there's any kind of variance in it, how much chaff comes out. I just keep all kinds of different notes as kind of my research.
That's good. I did the same thing when I roasted. I did the same thing for our coffee shop.
Maybe I love research too much, but it's been really fun. So I went back to my notes, and it's been interesting to see how roasting in the summer, how that's looked very different than some of the roasts that I've done in the winter. And just how there's so many factors that affect the roast of coffee.
Going back to the note taking, and how I have described coffee roasting to people is that there's a science behind it, and there is an artistic creativity behind it as well. And so the science there, it is, you have to get it to a certain temperature. You want to know when first crack, second crack, all of that kind of, all that whole process. You want to record that so you know for the next time, because there is also an artistic component to it as well, in terms of experimenting with blends and experimenting with how dark you take a single origin when you're roasting and different things like that. So it's a combination of the two. So taking notes is vital.
Yeah, which I've really enjoyed, and as someone who loves research, it's been really fun. But it has led me to realize just how many different factors affect the roasting process, and that's been really fun. To talk about hobbies. Some people's hobbies are, reading books. Some people sit and watch Netflix or, whatever. And this has become one of my hobbies, one of the things that is a way that I pass time. But even so, just for me personally, this has been one of the greatest additions to my routine in 2020. Adding this as a part of what I do has been so fun. And it gives me a way to, like you said, be creative and experiment and get different beans and try different different flavor profiles. Yeah. But it's also been a way that I can give back. I can share this with somebody. It's been a really neat just addition to my daily routine. And so in 2020, which has certainly been met with a lot of difficulty and hardship and exhaustion, I have really been grateful for the opportunity just to go on this journey of roasting coffee. So yeah, I'm really excited for that and can't wait to see what happens in this next year. The things that I'll learn, the things that we'll grow from, and hopefully keep creating some delicious cups of coffee. I'm currently drinking some Colombia coffee, a Colombian bean that I got recently. I got a big 5-pound bag of Colombian beans so that I could roast them as Christmas gifts. And so roasted it pretty dark, because a lot of people like that kind of dark, especially during the winter, a dark roast. So it's a little darker than I would normally roast it, but it's delicious. Lots of flavor. And again, it's just been such a fun experience for 2020.
That's great.
So Nate, tell us what's in the news.
It's my last in the news segment for 2020. And as I have over the last few episodes, I've tried to be very intentional about highlighting some positive news stories, because I felt like I was going down a very dark rabbit hole kind of in the beginning of the season, because there was
this is 2020.
I know. And so I wanted to end it on an upbeat. And so on Tuesday, December 8th, World Vision International released the results of a survey they had conducted. And the title of this article, it's found on WVI.org. And if you go to their newsroom link, you'll find it there. And we'll also add it to the show notes. But the title of the article is Charitable Spirit Alive After Difficult Year, as global survey shows over 3/4 of people want to focus on those who need help this Christmas. And I thought, especially for those of us maybe, and those of our listeners who have not purchased all of their Christmas gifts, this is just something to think about, and also something to know what's happening in our world. But over 3/4 of people surveyed, 76%, said it was important to focus on people in need of help this Christmas. A majority of people in 6 countries have either maintained or increased their charitable giving despite financial impacts of the pandemic. And almost 2/3, 63% of respondents, said they would prefer to receive a meaningful gift that would help others this Christmas rather than a traditional gift such as clothes or electronics. So I think, overall, this Christmas is obviously going to be much, much different than previous Christmases. And I think that it should also impact our gift giving as well. And so if you haven't yet purchased all your gifts, or you're thinking about some different gifts to give, one of the ideas out of this survey, and what almost 2/3 of people are looking at, is how can I give a gift on behalf to an organization or to help other people that may be on behalf of somebody, or some other creative way of helping people in need during this Christmas and holiday season. So I just wanted to highlight that and give you something to think about.
So I think this is really encouraging, because I think so often we think about at least in my mind, I think about, when I start struggling, do I tighten the belt, those kinds of things. Do we make it, do we try to preserve, and make sure that we're going to make it through rather than being charitable. But I think that this is a great reminder that even in really difficult times, people want to care for other people around them. Some of the people that are the most generous, most giving have been people that I've met that have very, very little in terms of wealth and finances, and yet they can be incredibly generous givers. And so in some ways, it's like this shouldn't surprise us that even when things get difficult, people want to give. But for some reason it does. It surprises me that in these difficult times that people are still have a passion for that. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful that we recognize that around the world there are people in need. And just because our world may look different doesn't mean that we still don't have a responsibility to care for others around the world. I think that that's one of the things that as a society, we tend to be so so individualistic that it's hard to think about others. And I'm grateful to see this, to recognize that it's not just about me. It's about how I interact and connect with people all around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said.
Well, today we want to do a recap of season 2. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because so often when we do our podcast, we intro an interview and then we let the interview play, but then we don't do any kind of an outro. We don't do any kind of like a here's what we loved that we heard from that, because in reality we want you to experience that. We don't want to tell you that this is what you should have heard or what you should have appreciated about it. We want you just to experience the interview for what it is, a story of what God's doing. But as we close this season, we really wanted to come back to some of those interviews and just ask that question, what were some of the things in season 2 that we as hosts like the most? What were some of our favorite episodes, favorite elements of this season, and why? And so each of us have chosen some of the things about this last season that we've really enjoyed.
Well, let's be clear, Andrew. You have forced us to identify 2 favorites because you couldn't decide.
I could not narrow it down to 1. I know. And actually as I couldn't narrow it down to 2. I had 4 and then I had to continue to peel off, and I finally got down to 2 that I think I just really loved the interviews. Well, I think we just had some great conversations this year.
We did.
I think about like the very first episode we did, which was with Corey and Abby Stocksdale, and we got to hear about them as I was sitting on their couch in Botswana where it was recorded. Like that was such a fun episode. And then to hear from the church in Botswana, to hear from Bobby and Jenny Measel about their experience of serving in Cote d'Ivoire. We just had some incredible, incredible conversations.
We did.
But each of us chose a couple that we just wanted to highlight of some of the things that we loved about them. So, Nate, what was one of the first episodes that you would highlight as something that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I think for me, the one that really stood out, and I will say, I think I chose my 2 favorites because of where we're at in our season of life and ministry and the transition that we're in and the conversations that we've been having as a family. And so these 2 episodes stood out. So the first one I'll talk about is episode 6 with Patrick Nachtigal, who along with his wife Jamie serve as the regional coordinators for Europe and the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, it's a great episode.
Back in 2015, I think. It's not even his most recent book, but he wrote the book In God We Trust. And so we wanted to have this conversation with Patrick right before the elections and talking about his book. And in his book, for those of you that haven't listened, please go back and listen to it. And that's one of the reasons why we do this recap episode, is to implore you to go back and at least listen to these 4 episodes. But in his book, he talks about, or he identifies 3 American gods: the American God of religious freedom, the American God of individualism, which you just referred to a few minutes ago, and the American God of materialism. What I pulled out of that, and what we have been processing together as a family as we have been thinking about our move to Spain, and not just living in Spain, but working throughout Europe and the Middle East, there's this lens that we wear, and it's called the lens of American Evangelical Church. And we have been raised, my wife and I, we've been raised in Northeast Indiana. She was raised in the Catholic Church. I was raised in a Protestant church. And I had the opportunity to be a part of several different kind of denominations, from the United Methodist to the Vineyard to the Mennonite Church, obviously the Church of God, Assemblies of God. And so I had a whole host of flavors of Christianity, especially in the evangelical world. But I wear that lens, and that's the lens that I interact with. It's the lens that I make decisions from. It's the lens I read the scriptures through. And I need to be aware of that lens when I go to other countries and realize that I am looking through that lens when I'm interacting with other cultures.
What you're pointing to is really, really important because, when I travel to another country and I think about the cultural differences, it takes a certain kind of thinking to be able to kind of step outside of yourself and say, okay, looking at who I am, I can look at somebody from another country and say, here are the cultural things that I see. But can I step outside of myself and look at myself and say, what are the things in me that are cultural? And I think that for many of us that have traveled, we've at least started to learn the skills that it takes to do that. But often we can leave it at things like things that are broad like culture and not dig into, but what does it mean to be a Christian in the United States versus a Christian in another country? And that's what I think Patrick does in this book is he forces us to kind of step outside and look back at ourselves, or maybe better to say look in a mirror and say, but what really is it that is a part of our Christianity, our faith, that is cultural, that is built on something that isn't necessarily just from the Bible, but it's the way that we read the Bible, and it's the way that we interact with the Bible and interact with others. And to me, that you're exactly right. And as you travel to Spain, that ability to step outside and look back at that and say, okay, what that I bring with me is truly Christian and what's cultural is a really important thing.
It is hard work because I've done this and I've had to do this, and I've talked through this process with my daughters, especially my oldest two daughters who are moving over with us. But we really need to kind of step back, step outside of ourselves and identify, okay, do I believe in this, or are my actions because I'm an American Christian and these are my American Christian values and principles, or are these biblical principles and values that I hold dearly and cause me to act a certain way or interact with others in a certain way? And so it takes practice. It takes a lot of intentionality, but it is so important as we interact with other cultures, as we do not impose our American values onto Scripture, number one, but then onto other cultures as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's this tension between wanting to stay grounded in Scripture and biblically centered in our values, principles, what we've been commanded and commissioned to do. And then there's this tension of, well, how, where does that end and where does that begin in terms of my American cultures and values, and not wanting to go full colonialism, as we have in the past, we meaning Christians and missionaries in the past. And so there's a lot of gray area in there as well, where we may make mistakes, and we probably will make mistakes, but it's owning those mistakes as well, and recognizing, and having conversations with national leaders and pastors and other Christians and other cultures as well.
And sometimes we don't even realize that we have views that are tied to that until someone challenges us, and we're like,
correct,
no, but I don't know why I disagree with that, but I and then it just that it like gets stuck inside your brain. You're like, I got to think about why I think the way that I do, why I'm so set that this is the way that I have understood this idea or this concept or this, and I think we have to be really careful. What are the foundational pieces of our faith? For me, of course, Jesus is foundational to our faith. But once we get outside of that and Jesus' role in my life and my faith, there's a lot that I have to be willing to hold somewhat loosely. That doesn't mean that I don't believe things, but I have to hold it loosely, recognizing that different people may come at scriptures in a different way.
Well, and I'll end our conversation here, but a food for thought for our listeners is when I say the word church, what do you think of?
Yeah.
Our answer to that question is going to look different in different cultures, and how closely do we hold our value of church and what church looks like, and how we have set up different models of church and things like that. And so that's just one example of many as we think of our American values. So
I think one of the challenges is we get to a point where we don't know where to go when someone says something or we hear something that challenges our current position on something. And so one of the things I heard recently in a book, I was listening to a book by David Livermore, highly recommend it. It's called Leading with Cultural Intelligence, a really fascinating book. But one of the things he says is that we need to be asking the question why. And we need to ask the question why at least 5 or 6 times when we enter into situations where we are confused about decisions that people are making. So
that's good.
When somebody comes up and says something that challenges me, I need to ask the question, okay, why does that not sit well with me? And then when I answer myself, I need to say, okay, why to that question, to that response, and keep pressing in until I get down to the root of why I really think and believe something, because the root may be something as simple as, well, that's the way I've always thought that it was.
Yep.
And if that is my response, then maybe that's an important time to start asking more questions, but I make it down to the root.
Why have I always thought that way?
Yeah, exactly. And so I just think that was a really helpful exercise of just continuously asking yourself why and pressing in and not allowing yourself to just go with, well, the answer is because that's the way it is, but to really press into that. And so I've been trying to challenge myself with that when I've come up against something that I don't understand or I feel like that doesn't seem right. Why would that person not think the way that I think? Start pressing and asking that question. And I think that, it just helps me have more grace for people that think differently.
So just kind of wrapping this up again, this whole conversation that we've just had over the last few minutes, we could go on with having a greater in-depth conversation with a lot of the information and the content that Patrick brings up in his book, In God We Trust. So go back and listen to that episode if you haven't, or if you have, go back and review that episode. It was based upon this conversation here. It may stir up some other questions that you may have.
So the first episode that I really enjoyed, and I chose 2 of them, was the conversation with International Justice Mission with Miguel Lau. And the reason that I love this conversation is just because that concept of justice is such an important part of my faith journey and my thought process and the way that I approach my faith and the Bible. And it's something that I think Jesus is passionate about. I think we see that in scriptures. I think that as we read scripture, we often miss that, which is one of the things I love that was brought out. We talked about the fact that the word righteousness and justice in Greek are often translated the same. And so we miss the word justice sometimes in the New Testament. But nonetheless, I think that it's an incredibly important part of what Jesus came to do, was to show us as humans what it means to live justly. And so I loved hearing stories of what International Justice Mission is doing in terms of supporting and caring for people who are experiencing injustice. We were able to talk about violence and the role of violence in that. But it was such a great conversation, and especially for those who may hear the word justice, and that's one of the words that gives them, that rubs them the wrong way. We were just talking about things that, where we have to ask the question why. I know that word justice can bring up so many other thoughts and connotations and ideas and concepts. I would really encourage you to listen to this episode, because I think that you'll start to hear a different perspective on that word. And again, hopefully, I think that word needs to be reclaimed in our Christian faith, because so much about what God's called us to do is about bringing justice, which is bringing this wholeness and healing to our relationships with ourselves, with God, with others, and with creation.
Obviously, one of the big phrases out there, or initiatives, or what's out there in the public square, I guess, is the term social justice. And I think the reason why people are afraid of that or kind of move the other way, I think a lot of it comes down to the perception that when you talk about social justice, you're removing the gospel or evangelism or your witness and testimony away from the work that you do. And I think, again, going back to what you just said, we have to ask the question, why? Why is social justice one of those things that we kind of put an arm's length up approach, especially, and I would say it's probably generational, I think.
Yeah, potentially.
When we talk to, and again, that's painting a broad brushstroke, but I think I'm in my, I'll just say mid-40s. But when I think of those, my generation and older, I think that is accurate. I think they think of social justice as something that's void of the gospel, void of sharing Christ with people and evangelism, things like that. Those who are younger than me see social justice as part of their Christian walk and Christian mandate and are very passionate about fighting those social justice issues or those injustices that are being done. And I think it's, there needs to be a conversation in terms of what does social justice look like with the gospel message. Yeah. Because for sure, we know organizations and people that do leave that out. And is there a way for that conversation to happen?
And I think that if we think about justice as something that has to be done on a societal level, like justice can't be something that I hold to myself, because justice is about the way that I treat others and the way that I interact with others. So in my mind, justice is almost always social. It's almost always about other people. Now, I know the term social justice brings with it a whole bunch of categories and concepts and ideas. And so my encouragement is to go back pre-1960s, 50s, and read about justice. I mean, one of my favorite phrases, I actually have it up on my wall, though nobody can see it because this is a podcast, is the phrase justice, mercy, truth. And that was a phrase that John Wesley used in his writings. And he used it over and over and over and talked about justice as being doing unto others as you would have them do to you. And mercy is about being the way that Christians are to love unconditionally everyone around them, to offer mercy, and truth being the fact that God is love. And he used those three concepts, justice, mercy, truth. He would say, that God at his creation, created humanity in the image of justice, mercy, and truth, and that image was broken, and that what we need to do is to return to this justice, mercy, and truth. And I love that because John Wesley's like 1700s, like he's way before this became a political thing, and yet is using that term in such a powerful way. And not just about justice in the sense of making right my relationship with God, but that in making right my relationship with God, that automatically has to affect my relationship with others. Yeah. And that's why he puts those terms together. It's not just about me and God. It's actually about the way that God transforms me into being a person that loves and cares for those around me. And so I love the way that Miguel was able to talk about that, and to me in a very non-political, and let's talk about this in the way that Christians need to hear and think about this term and this concept.
Yeah, and I love how your conversation also turned back to the local church and how the local church can get involved in some of these justice issues as well.
Absolutely.
Well, moving on, since you provided a runner-up or two, this is not my second favorite, but this is a runner-up, a close tie. And the reason why, because in my mind, this interview is with Kenneth Morking, my runner-up episode. To me, it's the epitome of what this podcast was all about. I mean, Absolutely. I was in the back of a rental car interviewing Kenneth, while two other teammates were driving the car, and we were driving across Bulgaria. We were asking him questions. Kenneth is from Cameroon, living in Bulgaria. And
so 4 grown men in a tiny European rental car, to me, is like, that image itself is worth the cost of the podcast, which is free.
Can I tell a quick story about that?
Yeah.
I will tell a very quick story. So 2 things. This was a rental car, like you said. It was a smaller car. It was like a sedan, 2-door, our 4-door, smaller sedan vehicle. The 4 of us were in. So we, unfortunately, this is not the funny part, but unfortunately we ended up going to a funeral.
Yeah.
In Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, one of the
which church itself was its own very cultural experience.
Yes. And I think, we have a summary of that, which at some point we will share on the podcast. Yeah. But that was a tremendous cultural experience. But we come out of the funeral ceremony, and across, I'm laughing as I'm saying this. It's hard for me to even get out, but across the hood, the entire width of the hood of the car is a huge scratch, and it's partly dented in, and there's like no other vehicles around. And I'm like, what in the world just happened? How did this even happen? And the only thing I can think of is when I pulled up and parked into that spot, several vehicle lengths in front of us, there were some caretakers, because at this funeral grounds, I guess, the cemetery where the funeral service was also held, the groundskeeper, they were taking care of the grave sites and all that kind of stuff. And they had kind of a mini truck. And the only thing I can think of is that they backed the truck up into our rental car and took off. And so it was very unnerving. So as if that wasn't bad enough, at some point in our drive, I can't remember when, and I will not name any names, but the passenger, and I think I was driving, so the passenger in the vehicle had the car window rolled down, had the mirror over to the side, kind of flipped it over to the side because the sun was shining in to block the sun, forgot that he had the mirror, the visor, I guess. I should say the visor, not the mirror. Had the visor over to the side, so it was to the right of him. Forgot that the visor was still there and proceeded to roll the car window up. The visor got stuck in the car window and consequently broke the mirror that was in the visor. Just shattered it. So we ended up having to put tape across the mirror and close that. So
did they even let you return that vehicle?
Fortunately, and this is always just a little travel note, always purchase the full insurance on rental cars when driving internationally and renting vehicles internationally. It's always a must. You should have seen the guy's face. He was utterly speechless when we did the walk around, and I had to explain to him, I have no idea what happened to the hood of your car. And I think there was even a long scratch on the side of the car as well. It was like, for those that have seen the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and what happened to their rental car. It didn't catch fire, but it looked like everything else that happened to it that happened in that movie. We were kind of scared, but also laughing as well.
That's funny.
Fortunately, we bought the full insurance, so it didn't cost us any extra. But as you can imagine, the owner of the rental car company, he was not very happy with us. He also had to drive us to the airport because he was our shuttle to the airport, and he was silent the entire time.
Well, this is a great behind the scenes. So as people listen to the podcast, they can be reminded of this behind the scenes look at what that travel experience was really like.
So think of that as you go back and listen to our episode with Kenneth Moraking. But so my second favorite is the interview that we just had, our most recent episode with Deb Hefner of Mission Training International. And again, part of that is the experience that our family had of coming out of MTI, but they do so much work in helping to prepare missionaries to move and to live cross-culturally, that it's such an important part of the missions community, whether it's through MTI or some other organization. As a pastor, as if you are on a missions committee, whatever your role in the local church is, I highly, highly recommend and advocate for your missionaries to receive training such as MTI, if not MTI. And then they also have the DAR, debriefing and renewal, which again is so important for missionaries who are coming back on furlough or home assignment or coming off the field entirely. So Deb, in this interview, she talks about her experience, her calling, and some stories, but then she also talks about the ministry of MTI and what they do in their DAR program as well as their Compass. And so I highly recommend it. It is really been a benefit for our family. And we've been back now for a few weeks, and we're starting to go through the material with our oldest two daughters who did not attend with us, but are going to be moving to Spain. And so I recommend to go back and visiting that episode.
Well, my last episode I wanted to highlight. So first of all, I loved Mike Ford's episode that you did, Nate, with Mike. Was another great interview. Mm-hmm. Mike is an incredible leader, pastor, missions thinker, and I was so grateful to have him share some just thoughts from a missions pastor perspective. And so if you do any kind of work in the local church with your missions, you need to listen to Mike Ford's podcast. But the last interview that I wanted to bring up was the interview we did with Pastor Wai Chan Lam, who's a Singaporean-born pastor that now serves the church in Japan. And that conversation was supposed to be in person, It's one of my great disappointments for 2020 is the lack of travel and just being able to be with people and to sit and have those conversations in person. I was supposed to be having this conversation in his home at the church, really seeing what he was talking about when he talked about the places that he serves, and disappointed that didn't happen, but so grateful for technology like Zoom, where then Nate and I both were able to interview Pastor Wai Chan and hear about his experience growing up in a Chinese, culturally Chinese home in Singapore, and growing up Buddhist, and then what that meant to then become a Christian at a young age, start attending church in his late teens as he was leaving the house, and then to be called to the mission field from that and to go and serve the church globally it really is a beautiful, beautiful testimony. And to me, like you just said about Pastor Kenneth, it's truly the reason that we wanted to do this podcast is to get to hear these kinds of stories and to be challenged by it. And so the one piece that I just want to lift out from that interview, and again, go back and listen to it. It's one of the longer podcasts, but it is worth hearing the things that Pastor Wai Chan shares. But one of the things I loved is he talked about the first time that he experienced Jesus in the Bible when he went to the church and he read it in Chinese.
Yeah.
And that Jesus first spoke to him in Chinese, and how important that was because his family had this perspective, specifically his mom had this perspective that Christianity was Western, that it was American, that it was English speaking. And the fact that Jesus first spoke to him in Chinese, he said, was really important for him. And, one of the things that I learned just in the last few years, someone mentioned that when you speak another language, your personality can also shift because of that language and because of the way that language, you interact with that language, the different characteristics of that language. Language isn't just taking the words you say in one language and changing them to another. You have to think about the ways that someone would express that same idea in another language. And that's why, he makes the comment that reading the Bible in a different language is like reading a totally different book. And I couldn't agree more. I think that, to me, that's one of the great benefits as Christians, if we want to stretch ourselves in our faith, is learning another language and then approach the Bible reading from that language and be challenged by the way that things get expressed differently. I'll connect this to the justice conversation. And I think I said this in the podcast, but the word righteousness in Spanish is justicia. So all throughout the New Testament, as you read the word righteousness, it's actually translated justicia, which is the word, what looks like the word justice. And so people in Latin American context often don't have as much of an issue coming to that concept of justice because they see it throughout the New Testament. But they're reading a Bible that's translated into their language, and so it's different than the way that we read it. So I love being challenged in my faith by cross-cultural interactions. And there were so many moments in that interview that I was challenged by things that he said that I thought, man, I need to process that more, or man, I need to write that down, and I need to sit with that a little bit because that's really good. And was so grateful that he gave us time to really listen and hear and share very honestly from his heart, transparently, about his experience of Jesus finding him, as he said, and then being able to live that out in this really cool opportunity in Japan.
Yeah, it was a great conversation for me, coming from the perspective of, again, growing up in Northeast Indiana. I've never been to China. I've never been to Singapore or Japan. Never have had a conversation with somebody who is a Buddhist or has grown up in a Buddhist home. And so it was just a cross-cultural experience for me in having that and being a part of that conversation. And so even just listening in on it, I think will be a challenge for you. And again, to go back and to listen to that if you have not, because I was challenged as well. I just think about how I have grown up in a Christian home my entire life. That's all I know. That's all I ever have known. And then to be converted or to go through a conversion process into a completely different faith that's different from your parents. I have no concept of what's that like. And the challenges that come along with that Wai Chan has had to experience.
We had an incredible season. I'm so grateful for those that have joined us throughout it to listen to these stories, and we have great things coming ahead. I mean, we hope we do. We trust that we do. So
we're going to.
So our next season starts February 1. The first Monday in February, we'll have episodes every 2 weeks as we have through June. Yeah. Anything, Nate, that you're looking forward to in this season 3?
Well, I don't know that I'm looking forward to some things that I have a bunch of different ideas on some things that we can do. Whether or not they stick, we'll just kind of throw them up on the wall and see what sticks. But I am toying around with changing my segment and doing a different segment. I may do some in the news segments every now and then, but I'm thinking through some other segments that I might introduce in the next season.
You could do in the pews. See, it could be about it could be about churches, or you could do.
I see what you did there.
You could do in the queues, and it could be about waiting in line in Europe, or you could do in the loos, and it could be about. Never mind. Okay, so we will.
Why does it have to rhyme with news?
Because I just think that because it does. Because that was the joke. I'm looking forward to this next season for the reason that you mentioned earlier. Just praying that there'll be some travel involved, and maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the first 6 months, but hopefully in the second 6 months of 2021 there'll be some travel, and that we can hear some stories from people on the ground. You know, episode 2 of this season at Botswana, you get to actually hear the church singing, and you get to be at a baptismal.
Yeah.
And like, those are some of the moments that I was really looking forward to bringing to this podcast that haven't been as present, because most of what we've done has been done via Zoom. So I'm looking forward to a season where more of those kinds of things can be a part of it. And
me too.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that will happen.
So hopefully you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you next year.
Yep, this is a great time to end because my coffee is empty, so it's time to get more. Hey, Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in Season 3. Thanks for listening to A World of Good. A World of Good is a podcast production of Global Strategy and Church of God Ministries. Our theme song is Colorado by Leo Flores. If you want to join the conversation, visit us at Twitter at A World of Good Pod, on Instagram, A World of Good Podcast, or visit our website, chogglobal.org/A World of Good. And join us next time as we share more stories of good from around the world.